The cabin lights dimmed, and a soft chime signaled the beginning of the boarding process for Horizon Airways Flight 725 from Miami to New York. Passengers in the business-class cabin settled into their seats, their conversations a low hum punctuated by the occasional rustle of luggage being stowed in the overhead compartments. Jessica Roberts, one of the lead flight attendants, moved with precision, her navy blue uniform immaculate and her blonde hair tightly pulled into a neat bun. Efficiency was her hallmark, though some might have called her approach icy. David Carter stepped into the cabin, dressed simply in dark jeans, a crisp white shirt, and a navy blazer. His presence was unassuming, on purpose. His brown leather carry-on was scuffed at the edges, a far cry from the designer luggage around him. He smiled at Jessica as he approached his seat, 3A, but she barely acknowledged him, instead focusing on a middle-aged man in an expensive suit 2 rows behind him. "Good afternoon, Mr. Jensen," Jessica chirped, her voice dripping with exaggerated warmth. "So nice to have you flying with us again." David paused briefly but said nothing, taking his seat quietly. He adjusted his blazer, folding it over the armrest. Jessica barely spared him a glance as she passed, her demeanor noticeably colder. "Excuse me," David said after a moment, his tone polite. "Could I trouble you for a glass of water?" Jessica's eyes flicked toward him, her lips tightening into a thin line. "We'll be serving drinks once everyone is seated," she replied curtly. Without waiting for a response, she turned and strode away. David leaned back in his seat, his expression calm but observant. Years of building Horizon Airways from a fledgling operation to one of the largest airlines in the country had taught him patience. He knew how to listen, to watch, and to let people reveal who they truly were. Today, it seemed, Jessica was making her feelings very clear. By the time the plane was cruising at 35,000 feet, Jessica's treatment of David had shifted from dismissive to downright rude. When she served drinks to the business-class passengers, she skipped his row entirely, only stopping when he gently tapped the edge of his tray table. "Excuse me," he said again, his voice calm. "I believe I was skipped." Jessica's smile was thin and insincere. "Oh, were you? My mistake." She placed a small plastic cup of water on his tray, the ice already melting. "There you go." David glanced at the untouched glasses of wine and sparkling water on other passengers' trays, but said nothing. As Jessica moved to the next row, he overheard her chatting animatedly with another passenger. First time in business class, one of her colleagues, a junior flight attendant named Lucy, whispered to Jessica when they regrouped at the galley. Jessica chuckled softly, glancing toward David's seat. "If it isn't, it's definitely his first time flying Horizon. You can tell." Lucy frowned. "Why do you say that?" "Look at him," Jessica replied, lowering her voice. "Not exactly our usual clientele, is he? No designer luggage, no high-end watch, and he asked for water." "Water? Who does that?" Lucy shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting toward David. "Maybe he just likes to keep it simple?" Jessica rolled her eyes. "Please. He probably got upgraded by accident. Or worse, someone's assistant booked him here without realizing." David, who had risen from his seat to stretch his legs, caught part of their exchange as he approached the lavatory. He paused briefly, allowing the weight of Jessica's words to settle. Instead of confronting her, he stepped back to his seat, his mind already turning over the implications of what he'd just heard. Lunch service provided yet another opportunity for Jessica to showcase her disdain. As she approached with the meal cart, her voice was syrupy sweet with every passenger except David. "Chicken or pasta?" she asked the passenger in 2C, her tone almost flirtatious. "Chicken, please," the man replied, smiling as Jessica placed the dish on his tray. When she reached David, the warmth in her voice vanished. "What do you want?" she asked flatly, barely making eye contact. David raised an eyebrow. "Chicken, please." Jessica thrust the tray toward him with minimal effort, the utensils rattling against the plate. "Here." "Thank you," David said evenly, his composure unshaken. Jessica didn't respond. Instead, she moved on to the next passenger, her demeanor brightening again. David caught a few side glances from other passengers, some of whom looked sympathetic, while others seemed embarrassed on his behalf. By the time dessert was served, Jessica's behavior had drawn the attention of Lucy, who discreetly pulled her aside. "Hey, is everything okay?" Lucy asked, her voice low but firm. Jessica frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean with 3A, Lucy said. "You're being different with him?" Jessica scoffed. "I'm not being different. I'm being professional." "Are you?" Lucy pressed. "Because it doesn't seem that way. He's polite, and he hasn't done anything to deserve whatever this is." Jessica waved her off. "He'll survive. Let's not waste time overthinking it." The tension came to a head an hour before landing when David pressed the call button for the first time. Jessica approached his seat, her expression tinged with impatience. "Yes?" she asked, her tone clipped. "Could you let the pilot know I'd like a quick word before we land?" David asked calmly, his gaze steady. Jessica blinked, her confusion evident. "The pilot's?" "Yes," David said, offering her a polite smile. "Tell Captain Ramirez it's David Carter." Jessica froze. The name registered somewhere in the back of her mind, but she couldn't quite place it. Still, she nodded, albeit reluctantly. "I'll pass the message along." Moments later, Jessica watched as David was ushered toward the cockpit. Captain Ramirez greeted him warmly, even stepping out of the cabin to shake his hand. The sight left Jessica unsettled, her earlier confidence faltering. "Do you know who that is?" Lucy whispered when Jessica returned to the galley, her tone urgent. Jessica shook her head.
"No."
"Should I?" Lucy hesitated. "I'm not sure, but Captain Ramirez doesn't just shake hands with anyone." And the way he addressed him, it sounded important. Jessica's heart sank as she replayed the interactions in her mind. For the first time, doubt began to creep in. Who was David Carter? And why did it feel like she had just made a monumental mistake? As the plane began its descent into New York, the cabin settled into a hushed anticipation. Jessica tried to focus on the usual landing preparations, but her thoughts kept circling back to David Carter. The way Captain Ramirez had greeted him gnawed at her, and Lucy's cryptic remarks only added to her unease. Jessica stole a glance at David as she walked down the aisle to collect trash. He was calmly reading a magazine, his demeanor unbothered by the chilly reception he had endured throughout the flight. The contrast between his calmness and her growing anxiety was maddening. She stopped at his row, forcing herself to maintain a professional tone. "Would you like me to dispose of that for you, sir?" she asked, gesturing to his empty water cup. David looked up, his dark eyes steady. "Thank you, but I'm fine for now." Jessica nodded stiffly and moved on, but her mind was racing. Why was he so composed? And why had the captain seemed to recognize him? When the plane landed and the fasten seatbelt sign dinged off, Jessica busied herself helping passengers gather their belongings. She avoided looking at David, but felt his presence like a spotlight. A well-dressed woman in the seat behind him struggled to retrieve her oversized carry-on. Jessica swooped in, her tone instantly warm. "Let me help you with that, ma'am," she said, hoisting the bag effortlessly. "Thank you so much," the woman gushed, flashing a grateful smile. Jessica turned to offer help to the next passenger, but David had already stood and retrieved his own modest bag. She bit the inside of her cheek. He hadn't asked for help, hadn't caused a fuss, and yet his self-sufficiency irritated her more than if he had complained. It felt like he was silently judging her. At the gate, passengers dispersed quickly, leaving the business class cabin eerily empty. Jessica took a deep breath, relieved the flight was over. She was about to turn to Lucy when David's voice stopped her. "Excuse me, Ms. Roberts," he said, his tone firm yet polite. Jessica stiffened, her heart thudding in her chest. "Yes?" she asked, spinning around to face him. "I'd like to have a word with you and your manager before I leave," he said. His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable authority behind it. Jessica's stomach dropped. Of course. Let me just..." She fumbled for words. "I'll call her right away." David nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'll wait." Jessica stepped aside, her hands shaking as she pulled out her phone. Lucy approached her cautiously. "What's going on?" "He wants to speak to me and the manager," Jessica whispered harshly. I think he's someone important. Lucy frowned. You didn't Google his name?
No.
I didn't think. Jessica stopped herself. What do you know? I looked it up while you were helping passengers, Lucy admitted, lowering her voice. David Carter, founder and CEO of Horizon Airways. Jessica's face went pale.
What?
Lucy nodded, her voice a mix of pity and disbelief. He owns the airline, Jessica. He's the reason we have these jobs. Jessica's knees felt weak. How had she been so blind? Every dismissive word, every subtle insult, every icy response played back in her mind like a damning montage. And now he wanted to speak to her manager. 15 minutes later, Jessica stood in a small conference room at the gate. Her manager, Diane, was seated at the head of the table, her demeanor calm but curious. David sat across from Jessica, his bag resting on the floor beside him. He leaned back in his chair, exuding a quiet confidence that only made Jessica more nervous. Mr. Carter, it's an honor to have you here, Diane began, offering a warm smile. We're always thrilled when you choose to fly with us. David nodded politely.
Thank you, Diane.
I appreciate that. His eyes shifted to Jessica. However, this isn't just a social call. Jessica felt her pulse quicken. She folded her hands tightly in front of her to stop them from shaking. I traveled anonymously today, as I often do, David said, his tone measured. It gives me a first-hand view of how our employees treat passengers, particularly those who might not fit the typical business class profile. Jessica's stomach churned. She knew exactly where this was going. David continued, his gaze unwavering. Jessica, would you care to explain why I was treated differently from other passengers on this flight? Jessica's throat went dry. She glanced at Diane, whose expression had shifted to one of quiet disapproval. I wasn't aware of who you were, sir, Jessica stammered. If I had known. David held up a hand, silencing her. That's precisely the problem. My title shouldn't dictate how I'm treated, nor should anyone's appearance or background. Every passenger deserves respect and dignity, regardless of who they are. Jessica's cheeks burned. You're absolutely right, Mr. Carter, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I apologize if my behavior was inappropriate. David's brow furrowed slightly.
If.
Jessica winced. I know it was. I'm sorry. David let the silence stretch for a moment, the weight of it pressing down on Jessica like a lead blanket. Finally, he spoke again, his voice softer but no less firm. Jessica, I'm not here to humiliate you, he said. I'm here to address a larger issue. Your actions today weren't just about me. They reflect on our company as a whole. Horizon prides itself on inclusivity and respect. If we fail in that mission, we fail our passengers, our employees, and our values. Jessica nodded, tears pricking the corners of her eyes. I understand. I'll do better. David regarded her for a long moment, then turned to Diane. I'd like to see improved training for all our staff, with a focus on unconscious bias and customer care. This incident can serve as a learning opportunity for everyone. Diane nodded, making a note on her tablet. Absolutely, Mr. Carter. We'll implement the necessary changes immediately. David stood, signaling the end of the conversation.
Thank you, Diane.
Jessica, I hope this experience helps you grow, not just as an employee, but as a person. Jessica swallowed hard, her voice trembling. It will, sir. Thank you for your understanding. As David walked out of the room, his calm stride a stark contrast to the storm raging in Jessica's mind. She realized the magnitude of her actions. This wasn't just a reprimand. It was a turning point. Whether she rose to the occasion or let it define her was entirely up to her. Jessica sat alone in the staff break room at JFK Airport, her untouched coffee growing cold on the table in front of her. The events of the morning replayed in her mind like a bad dream. Every time she thought she could push the humiliation aside, a fresh wave of regret would crash over her. The word "if" haunted her. If my behavior was inappropriate. The disbelief in David Carter's voice, the quiet disappointment in Diane's gaze. Jessica couldn't shake it. She knew she'd been wrong, but it was more than that. She'd been blind. Lucy entered the room, hesitating when she saw Jessica. "Hey," she said softly, approaching the table. "You okay?" Jessica looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. "Do I look okay?" Lucy sighed and sat across from her. "It's not the end of the world, you know. You can come back from this." Jessica let out a bitter laugh. "Come back from what?" "I disrespected the CEO of the company, Lucy. In front of passengers. What if I get fired?" Lucy leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "You won't get fired. Mr. Carter didn't want to humiliate you. He wanted you to learn from this. You're good at your job, Jessica. You just forgot what it means to treat people like people." The words stung, because they were true. Jessica had prided herself on being efficient, professional. But somewhere along the way, she'd lost sight of why she'd joined the airline in the first place. To help people, to make their journeys easier. "Do you remember why I got into this job?" Jessica asked, her voice cracking. Lucy nodded. "You said you wanted to make a difference. To help people feel seen." Jessica swallowed hard. "And now look at me." Later that day, Diane called Jessica into her office. The atmosphere was tense but not hostile. Diane motioned for Jessica to sit, her expression unreadable. "I spoke with Mr. Carter after he left," Diane began, folding her hands on the desk. "He's not asking for disciplinary action against you. In fact, he specifically requested that you be given the opportunity to reflect and grow." Jessica nodded, her stomach tightening. "I'm grateful for that," she said quietly. Diane's tone softened. "Jessica, you're one of the most efficient flight attendants on the team, but efficiency isn't everything. The way you treated Mr. Carter today, and frankly, how I've seen you treat other passengers in the past, shows a lack of empathy. That's not who we are as a company." Jessica felt her face flush with shame. "I know," she admitted. "I let my personal biases get in the way. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't right." Diane studied her for a moment, then leaned back in her chair. "Mr. Carter suggested we use this incident to implement additional training for the entire team. You'll be part of that process." Jessica hesitated. "What kind of training?" "Unconscious bias," Diane said simply. "It's clear that we all have room to grow, not just you." Jessica nodded, grateful for the chance to redeem herself, but also terrified of the uphill battle ahead. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said earnestly. "I hope so," Diane replied. "Because this is your chance to show not just the company, but yourself, that you can be better." Over the next few weeks, Jessica threw herself into the training sessions. She listened intently during lectures on empathy and unconscious bias, participated in role-playing exercises, and sought feedback from colleagues. It wasn't easy. Facing her flaws head-on was uncomfortable, but it was also enlightening. One afternoon, as part of the training, employees were asked to share stories of times they felt unseen or underestimated. Jessica hesitated, unsure if she should speak. But when she saw Lucy's encouraging nod, she raised her hand. "I've been where Mr. Carter was," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "Before I joined Horizon, I worked as a waitress at a high-end restaurant. Customers would judge me based on my appearance, my accent, even the way I carried myself. It made me feel small, like I didn't belong." She paused, taking a deep breath. "But somewhere along the way, I forgot how that felt. I became so focused on being efficient, on keeping everything running smoothly, that I stopped seeing people as people. And that's not okay." There was a brief silence as her words sank in. Then, one by one, her colleagues began to share their own stories. By the end of the session, Jessica felt a strange mix of relief and determination. She wasn't alone in her flaws, and she wasn't alone in wanting to improve. A month later, Jessica found herself back in the business class cabin, this time on a flight from Chicago to San Francisco. The passengers boarded as usual, and Jessica greeted each one with genuine warmth. When an older woman struggled to lift her bag into the overhead bin, Jessica stepped in without hesitation. "Let me help you with that, ma'am," she said, offering a kind smile. "Thank you, dear," the woman replied, her relief evident. As the flight progressed, Jessica moved through the cabin with a renewed sense of purpose. She made small talk with passengers, ensured everyone was comfortable, and even remembered to check on a nervous flyer who had mentioned being afraid of turbulence. By the end of the flight, one of the passengers, a businessman in his 40s, stopped her as he disembarked. "I just wanted to say, you're one of the best flight attendants I've encountered," he said. "Thank you for making this such a pleasant trip." Jessica's heart swelled.
Thank you, sir.
That means a lot. As she stood at the gate, bidding farewell to the last of the passengers, she spotted David Carter in the distance. He wasn't on her flight, but his presence was unmistakable. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave her a small nod before disappearing into the crowd. Jessica exhaled, a sense of peace washing over her. She knew she still had work to do, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was on the right path. Jessica couldn't shake the weight of David Carter's nod. Though brief, it carried a profound message, acknowledgement, perhaps even forgiveness. She replayed it in her mind as she prepared for another flight, determined to uphold the principles she'd been working so hard to embrace. But change wasn't instantaneous, and the next test of her growth came sooner than she expected. It was a packed flight from Los Angeles to Dallas, and tensions were high. A mix of weary business travelers, restless families, and frustrated holiday-goers filled the cabin. Jessica, now more self-aware, noticed subtle dynamics she might have ignored before. Passengers exchanged glances of annoyance, and small inconveniences quickly escalated into audible sighs or passive-aggressive comments. In the business class section, a middle-aged woman wearing a tailored gray suit tapped impatiently at her watch. "Excuse me," she said, stopping Jessica in the aisle. "I've been waiting 20 minutes for my drink. Are you always this disorganized?" Jessica felt the sharpness of the comment, but steadied herself. "I'm very sorry for the delay, ma'am," she replied, keeping her voice calm. "Let me check on that for you right away." She moved quickly to the galley, where Lucy was filling cups of water and wine. Jessica leaned in. "Do you have the drink for 4C?" Lucy nodded. "Working on it. She's been giving me the evil eye since takeoff." Jessica smiled faintly. "I'll take care of her." When Jessica returned with the woman's drink, her tone was as warm as she could muster. "Here you go, ma'am." "Thank you for your patience." The woman sniffed, but accepted the glass. Jessica could feel her eyes lingering, scrutinizing her every move. In the past, such interactions would have left Jessica bristling, maybe even lashing out subtly in return. But this time, she let it slide. Her focus remained on doing the job well, not letting her ego take over. Halfway through the flight, a new challenge arose. A young man in a faded hoodie was seated in 3B, visibly uncomfortable. He seemed out of place among the sleek suits and designer handbags of the other business class passengers. Jessica had noticed him during boarding, lugging a beat-up backpack and nervously looking at his ticket. Now, as she approached to check on him, she saw him clutching his stomach. "Sir, are you feeling all right?" she asked, crouching slightly to meet his gaze. He shook his head, sweat beading on his forehead. I think I ate something bad before the flight." Jessica's training kicked in. "Let me grab some ginger ale and crackers. They might help settle your stomach." The man nodded weakly, and Jessica hurried to the galley. She returned with the items and handed them to him carefully. "If it gets worse, let me know, and I can grab an ice pack or have one of our crew check in." The man's face softened with gratitude.
Thank you, he said.
"I was worried I'd just be ignored." Jessica smiled gently. "Not on my watch." As she walked away, she overheard a passenger murmuring in a dismissive tone. That's what happens when people upgrade beyond their means. Jessica turned to the speaker, an older man in 2A, his expression smug. For a moment, she considered ignoring the comment, but something inside her shifted. "Sir," she said, her voice firm but respectful, "every passenger deserves care and attention, no matter where they're seated or how they got here." The man blinked, caught off guard by her response. I didn't mean anything by it." Jessica held his gaze for a moment before moving on. She didn't want to escalate the situation, but she also refused to let prejudice slide unchecked. It was a small victory, but an important one. As the plane began its descent into Dallas, Jessica noticed a subtle change in the atmosphere. Passengers who had been curt or dismissive earlier now offered her polite smiles. The man in 3B, though still pale, gave her a quiet thumbs up as she passed. Even the woman in 4C seemed less icy, thanking her curtly as she handed over her coat. Jessica's confidence grew. The small acts of kindness she'd been practicing were starting to have a ripple effect, and she could feel the difference in how the cabin felt. But her real test came after the flight. As passengers disembarked, Jessica stood at the front of the cabin with Lucy, bidding each one farewell. The young man from 3B stopped in front of her, his backpack slung over one shoulder. "I just wanted to say thanks again," he said, his voice soft but sincere. "You didn't have to go out of your way for me, but you did." That meant a lot. Jessica felt a lump rise in her throat. "It was my pleasure," she said, smiling. "I hope you feel better soon." He nodded and disappeared into the terminal. Moments later, Jessica was approached by the woman from 4C, who hesitated before speaking. "I may have been a bit harsh earlier," the woman admitted, glancing away. "You handled everything well, despite the chaos." Jessica blinked in surprise. "Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate that." The woman nodded stiffly and left, leaving Jessica feeling both shocked and relieved. In the crew debriefing later, Diane joined them, her expression neutral. "I heard this flight was challenging," she said. "But I also heard from several passengers that the service was excellent. That's exactly what we aim for at Horizon." Jessica exhaled, a small smile creeping onto her face. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she'd truly turned a corner. The lessons she'd learned from David Carter, and from her own past, were finally becoming a part of who she was. That evening, as Jessica sat alone in her hotel room, she received an email notification on her phone. It was from Horizon's leadership team, summarizing recent employee feedback and company updates. Near the end of the message, one sentence stood out. "We've received reports of exemplary service from Flight Attendant Jessica Roberts, who demonstrated Horizon's core values on a recent flight. Thank you, Jessica, for embodying the spirit of our mission." Tears welled in her eyes as she read the words. The journey wasn't over, but this acknowledgement felt like a step toward redemption. For the first time in a long time, Jessica believed she could truly become the person she'd always wanted to be. Jessica sat at the front of the training hall, her palms slightly damp as she clutched the edges of her presentation notes. The room was filled with Horizon Airways employees, flight attendants, customer service representatives, and even a few mid-level managers, all there for the newly introduced customer care and unconscious bias training. Just a few months ago, Jessica would have been one of the skeptical faces in the crowd, half listening and eager for the session to end. Now, she was leading it. The irony wasn't lost on her, but instead of shame, she felt pride. Her journey had been far from perfect, but it had brought her here, and for that, she was grateful. Taking a deep breath, she stood and approached the podium. The room quieted, 100 eyes turning to her. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice steady. "My name is Jessica Roberts, and I've been a flight attendant with Horizon Airways for 5 years. Today, I want to share a story, one that taught me a hard lesson about what it means to truly see people." The room was silent as Jessica recounted her experience with David Carter on that fateful flight. She didn't shy away from the details. Her dismissive tone, her assumptions, the subtle but insidious way she had let bias shape her behavior. She could see some members of the audience shifting uncomfortably in their seats, but she pressed on, knowing the discomfort was necessary. "When I learned who Mr. Carter was," Jessica continued, "I was mortified. But it wasn't just about him being the CEO. It was about realizing how many passengers I'd treated unfairly simply because they didn't fit the mold I thought they should. That realization changed everything for me." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Mr. Carter didn't humiliate me or punish me. Instead, he gave me an opportunity to grow. That's what this training is about, not pointing fingers, but giving each of us the tools to be better." Jessica scanned the room, meeting the eyes of a few employees who looked particularly thoughtful. We all have biases, whether we realize it or not. But it's how we address them that defines us. Every passenger we serve deserves dignity and respect, just as every colleague we work with does. After the session, several attendees approached Jessica to thank her. One woman, a veteran flight attendant nearing retirement, admitted, "I've been in this job for over 20 years, and I've never heard anyone speak so honestly about these issues. You've given me a lot to think about." Jessica smiled warmly. It's never too late to learn. As the room cleared, Jessica gathered her materials, her heart full. Leading the session had been nerve-wracking, but also incredibly rewarding. She'd turned one of the lowest moments of her career into an opportunity to inspire others, and that felt like a victory. Later that week, Jessica received an unexpected email from David Carter. Subject: Thank you, Jessica. I heard about the training session you led this week. Several employees mentioned how impactful your story was. Thank you for sharing your experience so openly. I've always believed that growth comes from facing our mistakes, and you've proven that. You've turned a difficult moment into something positive, not just for yourself, but for the entire Horizon team. Keep up the great work. I'm proud to have you on board. Best regards, David Carter. Jessica read the email twice, her chest swelling with emotion. The nod at the airport had felt like closure, but this felt like validation. David Carter, the man she'd once dismissed and underestimated, now saw her as someone who embodied the values he'd built Horizon Airways on. Months later, Jessica's transformation continued to ripple through the company. The customer care and unconscious bias training became a core part of Horizon's culture, with employees reporting improved teamwork and passenger satisfaction. Jessica, now recognized as a leader in her field, was invited to join a special committee focused on enhancing employee engagement. Her personal growth also extended beyond her professional life. Jessica found herself more aware of her interactions with strangers, more empathetic to people's struggles. She no longer judged passengers by their appearances or assumptions she might have made in the past. Each interaction was an opportunity to connect, to help, and to make someone's journey a little easier. On a quiet evening, as Jessica walked through her neighborhood, she reflected on how far she'd come. Her path hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. She thought about David Carter, the passengers she'd wronged, and the ones she'd served well. Each of them had played a role in her journey, shaping her into someone she was finally proud to be. At the end of the day, Jessica realized it wasn't just about the job or the title. It was about the small moments, the smiles, the gestures, the decisions to be kind even when it wasn't easy. Those were the things that mattered. And those were the things she would carry with her every day for the rest of her life.